Well, good evening. Welcome to Down the Road here on Beck TV. I'm Tyler Axness, filling in for the vacationing Joel Heitkamp. We'll be back taking a ride with you a little bit later on here in the month of March. There's so much to get to, ladies and gentlemen, and of course, top of the mind of people around the world is the escalation of the Russian war in Ukraine. And quite frankly, there's a lot of angles that we can talk about and how it's impacting all of us right here in North Dakota, Minnesota, South Dakota, wherever it is you're watching us worldwide online at Beck TV, because you've got all these variables. You've got oil, you've got the humanitarian crisis, you've got what it's doing to agriculture, Ukraine being the breadbasket, so to speak, over on that side of the world. But quite frankly, how do we get here? What does it mean when it continues to escalate about a week into Vladimir Putin's orders to invade an unprovoked country and start an unprovoked war? Here to help us understand a little bit more of that is a friend of mine. He's a senior fellow at Mershon Center for International Security Studies and an associate professor of law at The Ohio State University. His name, Dakota Rudesill. Dakota, I appreciate you taking some time to join us here on Beck, and I don't know where to even begin. As I was just saying, there is so much to unpack here. You study this. You've run some war games from what I've gathered, kind of breaking this down, but it's been a week. I'm curious, over the week, what have you been watching?
Yeah, well, I won't sugarcoat it. NATO and Russia are on the edge of war. This is the worst international security crisis that we have seen in certainly at least since the end of the Cold War, right around 1980, 1990. I think it's worse than 9/11 in the sense that 9/11 was obviously horrible, but Al Qaeda was not going to destroy the world. There was no sort of escalation risk. Right now, Russia's invaded Ukraine. They're brutalizing that country because they're a democracy. So far, it hasn't spread to the countries of NATO in Eastern Europe. It hasn't spread to us. We're legally obligated to defend NATO, but it could very easily escalate in that direction. So, I couldn't be more worried, frankly.
As far as escalation, you mentioned NATO. I think one thing that took me back is, Vladimir Putin had his goals of breaking NATO, of reclaiming Ukraine, reestablishing the Soviet Empire. I mean, there's a lot of angles here. I don't know that a lot of people expected the rapid response, the rapid rally around the Allies as what we saw over the course of this last week, all the way from Germany, what they've been doing with funding of defense. I mean, were you as surprised as at least some average Joes like myself of how quickly our allies really decided to take action? Not necessarily physical and military, but just whether it's moving money, the sanctions, all of it came so rapidly. Did it surprise you at all, Dakota?
It frankly has. The invasion itself was something that, as you and I were talking about on your radio show the other day, the U.S. intelligence community did a really good job of telling the world what the Russians were up to and what was coming. I think that Putin has been surprised by the response of Europe in particular. I think a lot of Europeans have been surprised about that. It's really been extraordinary. Not just money and material and weapons, the Javelin missiles, other things being sent. And now old Soviet-era jet fighters that are in the arsenals of Eastern European countries that were admitted to NATO after the Soviet Union cracked up. Those are being sent to Ukraine. But there's all sorts of other things. Germany just did a dramatic change in their whole foreign policy approach, dropping $100 billion on modernizing their military. They have decided they're not going to be buying any more Russian oil, and Russian oil is a majority of their energy imports. All the airspace closures, the United Diplomatic Front, it's really, frankly, pretty impressive.
You had mentioned something, and I'm going to tie these two together because you're worried, is one thing you said, and tensions. I mean, as of now, there hasn't been an attack on NATO or us legally obligated, to defend if that, heaven forbid, does happen. If you're Vladimir Putin, which no one wants to be, and nor should they ever want to be, but you're watching as allies, NATO is ramping up, and they're providing, defenses to Ukraine, the civilians and the military there. I mean, do you see any blurred lines in his psyche, which we'll get into in a little bit as far as experts wondering how isolated and out of touch he's become? But do you fear at all, as you're these countries that are providing, I think, some much needed defense and assistance, that that's going to be viewed as an act of war from the Russian side?
Yeah, you've put your finger on a really, really critical issue. And that is, at what point does Vladimir Putin decide that basically NATO has entered the war on the side of Ukraine? So far, NATO, led by the United States, have diplomatically supported Ukraine. They've sent financial aid, they've sent material, humanitarian assistance, all sorts of different weapons. We're reading the paper today that the United States is providing intelligence to the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian military on Russian military movements. And I would imagine, too, that the United States, the NSA and the U.S. Cybercom are active in a cyber sense in defending Ukraine. So at what point in his mind does he decide, well, the United States and its NATO allies have actually entered this war on the side of the Ukrainians, and therefore he's going to extend it to NATO? And I think, that's an extremely alarming prospect, because then the war is larger. It could potentially escalate. But I think we need to think, too, that in Putin's mind, fighting a limited war with NATO actually might be good for him. It might help him domestically in dealing with a Russian population and, frankly, a Russian military that we're seeing all sorts of evidence that they're not excited about his war. If he's now fighting NATO, Russia's arch enemy, man, that's better for him from a domestic standpoint.
To get that engagement from NATO, to have that rallying that he's probably so desperate for at this point. I mean, how does he get to the point from his actions that that NATO decides, hey, we can no longer sit back and watch? I mean, Dakota, I've been seeing the back and forth, and I think people have good intentions, but they're talking about the need for enforcing a no-fly zone from NATO. I mean, at what point? Where do you see this heading? Let me ask you this way. Is there anything Putin could or would do to the Ukrainian people that would instigate the need for NATO to be involved?
Well, I think that's a judgment call that NATO leaders would need to make. I think that, anybody listening to this as a citizen in our country needs to do some reflection, from their standpoint. At what point are we willing to shed American blood because Russia has done something to Ukraine? We need to ask ourselves, is it deliberate attacks on civilians? Well, there have already been deliberate attacks on civilians by Russia. Is it just kind of a extent of it? I mean, is it going to take, 100,000, 200,000 dead Ukrainian civilians? Is it going to take something like Tiananmen Square in 1989 when the Chinese Communist regime rolled its tanks over thousands of pro-democracy protesters in the Chinese capital? I mean, and I'm not trying to suggest an answer there. I'm just saying, what is our red line in terms of what happens in Ukraine that's so horrible that we decide we're going to fight a war with Russia? And you mentioned a no-fly zone. I think that if the United States and its NATO allies tried to put our jet fighters in the air over Ukraine, I think we are at war at that point, because the Russians are going to contest that. Our planes are going to be shooting at each other. And how do you control that from escalating?
Well, and that's the very debate I've been seeing is, again, people have probably good intentions. They're watching as, people are claiming war crimes are already being committed by Putin and the Russian army, in certain aspects, to where, look, you're seeing the satellite imagery and seems to be an opening at times. But as you're saying, is that the red line? Do you risk that escalation that could, quite frankly, lead to what commentary he's already put out there, and being the sole individual in charge of, say, a nuclear weapon? And that's something that I want to talk about when we come back here in just a little bit, because you had a piece that you wrote about this very issue, and it has to do with a nuclear arsenal, the control, the command, having one individual be in charge of that individual in this case being a dictator in Vladimir Putin, and quite frankly, the rhetoric he's been amping up, saying, look, we're on high alert. Do you got more time for me, Dakota?
You bet.